They shaved her head in a courthouse hallway, laughed in her face, and told her she didn't belong. 3 minutes later, they found out she was the judge. It started quietly. The kind of morning Charleston hadn't seen in weeks. Cool, still, not a cloud in the sky. At 7:58 a.m., a silver Buick pulled up along the curb outside the federal courthouse. From it stepped a black woman in a navy blue blazer, pressed slacks, and polished low heels. Her hair, silver and coiled, was tucked neatly into a bun at the nape of her neck. In one hand, she carried a leather portfolio. In the other, nothing at all. No coffee, no phone, just purpose. The security checkpoint was already backed up, lines forming under the low buzz of fluorescent lights and rustling paper trays. Some folks looked down at their feet. Others tapped impatiently on their watches. But when the woman stepped onto the stone steps, her heels clicking softly with each step, a subtle shift occurred, not in noise, but in presence. She walked with the calm of someone who didn't need to be loud to be respected, or so she thought. Deputy Hank Riker saw her before she even reached the front of the line. His posture stiffened. He adjusted his belt like he did whenever he felt the need to remind someone who was in charge. She was almost through when he raised a gloved hand and said, "Ma'am, step out of line." The room didn't fall silent, but the energy dipped, as if the floor itself braced for something. The woman turned slowly, eyebrows barely lifting. "Is there a problem, officer?" Riker didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned her, skin, hair, posture, poise. Something about her made him uncomfortable, made him feel challenged. It wasn't what she did. It was how she stood, how she looked like she belonged here. No ID displayed. You can't just waltz into a federal building looking like that. Without a word, she opened her blazer and pulled out a federal badge. It gleamed beneath the overhead lights, official and unmistakable. Riker took it from her hand, gave it a glance, then slid it into his pocket like a gum wrapper. She blinked once. "I'd like that returned." He stepped closer. "You in a rush, sweetheart." The word hit the air like a slap. A younger female officer by the X-ray scanner flinched, but said nothing. "I need to get to a courtroom," the woman said firmly. "Then you'll follow my procedure," Riker snapped. "That includes random checks." He didn't wait for permission. He grabbed her upper arm, not roughly, but deliberately, and steered her away from the line, away from the public, down a quiet hallway past a supply closet and into a small, windowless screening room. Inside, the lights buzzed overhead. A steel chair sat in the center of the room. Against the wall, a tray of handheld scanners, and on the edge of a metal cart, idle but plugged in, a pair of electric clippers. The woman's eyes narrowed. "I don't consent to this. You have no legal basis. You're acting suspicious. That's cause enough." She didn't sit. Riker took a step forward. "You think that badge means something? Not in here." Two more officers entered behind her. One tall with a nervous twitch in his eye. The other younger, blank-faced. Without warning, they grabbed her wrists. She didn't scream. She didn't pull. She simply said, "You are violating federal protocol. I will file formal complaint." Riker reached for the clippers. "What are you doing?" "Standard check," he muttered, waving at her head. "You could be hiding something in that mop." Her breath hitched just once. The clippers came to life with a mechanical buzz, loud in the silence. She tried to stand. A firm hand pushed her back down, and then the cold steel touched her scalp. A coil of silver fell, then another, and another. No one spoke. One of the guards chuckled under his breath. "She looks better already." "Should have come in here with some respect," Riker said, wiping stray hairs from his uniform. "Now you look presentable." Her fists clenched in her lap. The skin over her knuckles pale, but her voice, when it returned, was steady. "You'll regret this." Riker leaned in, eyes glinting with disdain. "People like you always say that." Then he stood, switched off the clippers, opened the door and gestured lazily. "You're free to go, courtroom S that way." She rose slowly, reached for her badge on his desk. He didn't stop her. She didn't thank him. She walked out with hair uneven, scalp raw, but spine straight. Her heels clicked again, but this time not softly. They echoed. She didn't look back, didn't curse, didn't ask why, because she already knew the answer, and in exactly 3 minutes so would they. She walked slowly, not because she was in pain, but because she refused to rush through the weight of what had just happened. The hallway outside the screening room was quiet, unnaturally so. A janitor sweeping near the corner glanced up, froze, then quickly looked away. A pair of clerks stepped aside without a word. No one asked if she was okay. No one dared meet her eyes. The sound of her heels returned, muted now, less rhythm, more defiance. Her silver hair, once coiled with precision, was now patchy and uneven. Tufts stuck out at odd angles. A raw strip marked the crown of her scalp where the clippers had bitten too close. But her posture didn't waver. She passed a conference room with the door slightly ajar. Inside, 3 attorneys spoke in low tones. One of them caught a glimpse of her and fell silent mid-sentence. His mouth stayed open, but no sound came. She kept walking. There was still time to leave, to go home, to cry, but she didn't. Instead, she turned left at the end of the corridor toward the main courtroom. A sign beside the double doors read, Courtroom 1, Public Hearing on Police Misconduct, 9:00 a.m. She reached for the handle, paused, then pushed it open. The courtroom was full. Attorneys filled the front rows. Journalists leaned over laptops. Officers sat stiffly in uniform. Families of victims, civil rights observers, interns with notepads, every seat taken. The room buzzed with anticipation. Everyone was waiting for the judge to emerge from chambers. They didn't look up when she entered, not right away. She walked down the central aisle without urgency. No one stopped her. She didn't speak, didn't gesture. Her steps were even, deliberate, loud enough to be noticed, soft enough to be dismissed, until she reached the bench. And then she climbed the 3 steps. It happened slowly. A murmur rose from the gallery. A woman near the back frowned. A defense attorney tilted his head. Someone whispered, "Isn't that the?" No one moved. She reached the judge's chair, draped in black fabric. Her robe was folded neatly across the armrest. Still, no one said a word. Then she turned. And the room changed. One by one, they recognized her. The woman who had just walked through the courthouse with uneven hair and quiet fire. The one they saw being led down the hallway as if she didn't belong. The woman they assumed was just another witness, another victim, another citizen. She picked up the robe and slipped her arms into it. Slow, measured, no help, no bailiff, no formality. When she fastened the collar and adjusted the sleeves, her hands didn't shake. She turned to the court clerk, who stood frozen with a docket in hand. Her voice was low, clear. "Is the court prepared to begin?" The clerk hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." It was only then that the silence cracked. A chair scraped. Someone dropped a pen. A journalist gasped audibly. The police officers at the defense table stiffened. One of them reached instinctively for his tie, adjusting it like it might save him. And in the corner near the side entrance, Deputy Riker stood motionless. His face lost color. His jaw slackened. His lips moved without sound. She did not look at him. She faced forward. The courtroom held its breath. And the woman they thought they had humiliated was no longer just standing. She was presiding. They didn't know her name, not yet, but they would. Court was in session. The hum of whispered conversations had faded. Reporters poised over keyboards, ready. The clerk read the docket, her voice steady, though her hands trembled faintly. Celeste Monroe sat tall behind the bench, robe falling heavy over her shoulders. She did not smile. She did not blink more than necessary. Her presence alone held the room in check. Across from her sat the prosecution team. To the right, the defense attorneys shifted in their seats. The defendants, several officers under investigation for misconduct during last year's protests, looked anywhere but at the bench. Celeste called the first witness, a protester named Howard Briggs. He took the stand, voice weathered, eyes hollow. He recounted how his son, 17, unarmed, had been tackled by officers, his windpipe nearly crushed. Celeste listened, took notes, asked no questions, not yet. A second witness followed, a retired teacher. She described officers knocking over elderly demonstrators, laughing as they stepped over their bodies. Celeste listened again, still calm, still silent. From the back of the room, Deputy Riker stood near the exit, arms folded. He hadn't moved since the session began. He watched the witnesses, watched the attorneys, but never once looked at Celeste. Not directly. His face betrayed nothing, but his fingers twitched. His stance shifted slightly every few minutes. He thought it was over, that the clippers and the locked room were separate from what was happening here. He was wrong. Celeste set her pen down, lifted her gaze. Deputy Hank Riker stepped forward. The room stilled. Riker didn't move at first. Then slowly, reluctantly, he pushed off the wall and walked toward the center of the courtroom. The click of his boots echoed louder than it should have. "State your full name for the record." He hesitated, looked to the side, cleared his throat. "Hank Riker." "How long have you served as deputy bailiff in this courthouse?" 14 years. Celeste's voice did not rise, but her words struck with precision. "And in those 14 years, how many women have you physically detained without documented cause?" Riker blinked. "Your Honor, I don't. That's not what I asked." His lips parted. "I'm not sure. I don't keep account." Celeste leaned forward slightly. "How many formal complaints have been filed against you?" Riker swallowed. "Maybe 2, 3. Her voice cut through the courtroom like glass. 12. 12 complaints, on record, documented, filed by individuals who claimed excessive force, verbal harassment, unnecessary detainment. Do you deny this?" "I didn't know, Your Honor. I never saw any of that reach my desk." "That's because you never needed to see it. You knew no one would hold you accountable, that your behavior would be signed off, hidden behind policy." He opened his mouth again. Nothing came out. She stood. "Let me ask you this, Deputy Riker. What is my name?" He froze. "Excuse me, my name, what is it?" Riker's eyes darted. "I don't know, ma'am, exactly. You never asked. You didn't care. Because to you, I was just another black woman who looked like she didn't belong, who needed to be put in her place. That's what this was about. Not procedure, not protocol, but power, yours." She walked slowly around the bench. The room held its breath. "You took my badge. You called me sweetheart. You put your hands on me. You stripped me of dignity under the guise of security, and you laughed. Do you deny that?" Riker's mouth moved, but still no sound. She turned to the clerk. "For the record, this court finds probable cause to initiate a formal investigation into Deputy Riker's conduct, including, but not limited to, unlawful detainment, abuse of power, obstruction of judicial function, and assault against a federal judge." Gasps echoed across the gallery. Celeste faced the 2 officers at the side door. "Escort Deputy Riker into custody. Separate holding. Do not process him with general population." "Wait, Your Honor, wait. I didn't know who you were." "That's the point." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. As the officers stepped forward and took Riker's arms, he stiffened. Panic crossed his face for the first time. He looked around the courtroom, searching for someone, anyone, to step in. No one did. His badge was removed from his belt, his radio taken, his wrists cuffed. Celeste returned to the bench. "This hearing will continue. Justice does not pause for the comfort of the guilty." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with something heavier: recognition, reverence, and fear, not of her, but of the truth, because now they all knew her name, and it wasn't over. Not even close. The chambers were quiet, too quiet. The hum of the courthouse beyond its walls had dulled into a distant murmur. Celeste sat at her desk, robe draped over the back of her chair like a burden temporarily set down. The overhead lights cast soft shadows across the uneven lines of her scalp. A few strands clung stubbornly near her temple, but most of it was gone, shorn away not out of choice, but control. She didn't touch it. Not yet. Her fingers rested calmly over a closed file, though her jaw was tight with thought. There was a knock. It was tentative, almost embarrassed. "Come in." The door opened just enough for a young woman to slip inside. She looked barely out of college, glasses fogged at the edges. A courthouse intern, still wearing her laminated badge clipped to her cardigan. Megan. Celeste recognized her. Quiet, on time, smart. The kind of girl who observed more than she spoke. Megan didn't speak at first. She shut the door slowly, turned around, and just stood there. Then her shoulders started to shake. "I saw it," she whispered. Celeste looked up. "This morning, outside the screening room, I saw what he did. I didn't stop him. I didn't say anything. I just stood there." Her voice cracked under the weight of it. "I was scared. He looked at me once, and I looked away. And then he shut the door, and I just kept scanning bags like nothing was happening." She wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater. "I'm so sorry." Celeste didn't respond right away. She studied Megan's trembling hands, the shame she was trying to hold inside. "Thank you for telling me. I didn't stop it." "No. But you're speaking now. That matters." Megan nodded barely. "If you need me to testify, I will." Celeste reached across the desk, placed a steady hand over hers just for a moment. No judgment, no ceremony, just warmth. There was another knock, this time firmer. The door opened and a man stepped in, tall, older, dark suit worn with grace, not flash. Reverend Marcus Hill. His hair was grey now, his beard fuller than when she'd last seen him. But the quiet strength in his eyes hadn't changed. "Judge Monroe," he said gently. "Reverend," she replied, standing, "I won't keep you long. I know the day's not over." He held out a folded piece of paper. "I came to let you know we're out there, watching, listening. We see what you're doing, and we're with you." She took the paper and unfolded it. Names, dozens of them, with numbers, some with notes. What is this? People who have been hurt by Riker. By others like him, some recent, some years back, some too scared to ever come forward. Until now, she scanned the list, eyes slowing over names she didn't recognize, but that didn't matter. How many are new, most, and the others? Some go back a decade, maybe longer, but they were never called, never heard. If you want their stories, they're ready. Celeste looked up. There was something rising behind her sternum, not anger this time, not sorrow, something deeper. They were told it wasn't worth it. They were wrong. "It is now," he nodded, almost smiled, then turned to go. When the door closed again, Celeste sat back down, the list still in her hand. She stared at it, not as evidence, not as data. As lives, as voices waiting just beyond the walls of the courtroom. This wasn't just about her anymore. This had never been just about her. The file landed on her desk without a word. No knock, no explanation. Just a quiet handoff by a court administrator who looked as if the folder burned his fingers to touch. He didn't wait for thanks, didn't meet her eyes, just set it down, nodded once, and left the room like someone trying to escape the weight of the truth. Celeste stared at it for a long time before opening it. Manila, thick, the kind of folder that doesn't arrive unless someone wants to make sure you see what was never meant to be seen. She pulled it open, 12 complaints, each with its own file number, each detailing a different accusation: use of force, harassment, inappropriate language, illegal detainment against Deputy Hank Riker, some handwritten, some typed, some with witness signatures, some with bruises photographed in black and white. She read them one by one, slowly, carefully, as if the act of reading was itself a kind of prayer. But it wasn't just the complaints that made her stomach tighten, it was the decisions. Each one stamped, closed, dismissed, allegation unsubstantiated, lack of corroborating evidence, no further action required. And then she saw it, the signature at the bottom of every dismissal: Judge Terrence Mahoney, her mentor, her sponsor, the man who had once told her over a quiet lunch years ago, "You're exactly what the bench needs, Celeste." Smart, measured, unshakable. She remembered that conversation, the way he smiled when she was sworn in, the letter he wrote to the nominating committee, the way he stood in the front row when she put on her first robe. Now she stared at his signature, neat, unwavering, beneath line after line of refusal. He hadn't just ignored these complaints, he'd buried them. She flipped to the final document in the folder, a memo marked confidential, 5 years old, internal correspondence between Judge Mahoney and the head of courthouse security. She read it twice to be sure. Riker may be rough around the edges, but he keeps order, especially with certain groups. Best to leave well enough alone. Her fingers curled around the edge of the page until the paper crumpled under her grip. There it was, the quiet part said out loud, not just indifference, endorsement, not just negligence, strategy. She sat back in her chair, the air in the chambers shifted. It felt thinner, colder, like something sacred had just been broken and couldn't be put back together. The robe on the hanger caught her eye. She used to think it meant something: authority, justice, legacy. But now she wondered how many people wore that robe while closing their eyes to what happened under it. She pressed her palms together, closed her eyes, not to pray, not to grieve, just to hold still long enough to stop shaking. Because this wasn't about one man with a badge and a pair of clippers. It was about the system that handed him those tools and called it order, about the judge who trained her to uphold the law while quietly signing off on its erosion. She opened her eyes again, and something inside her was different now, not broken, clarified. Celeste reached for a pen, scribbled 3 words on a sticky note and pressed it onto the cover of the folder. Keep this visible. Then she stood, straightened her shoulders, and walked back toward the courtroom. The truth wasn't just coming out, it had already arrived, and it had her signature now. The courtroom was full again, but it wasn't the same room anymore. Not after what had already unfolded. This time, the press benches were packed shoulder to shoulder. DOJ representatives stood near the back, arms folded, watching. Civil rights observers sat silently, pens poised. Every eye in the room tracked a single figure behind the bench, Judge Celeste Monroe. She didn't speak at first. She didn't need to. Her presence was louder than words. Then a voice cut the stillness. Your Honor, the defense requests a motion to address the issue of judicial bias. A lawyer in a tailored pinstripe suit stood from the defense table, chin lifted, voice polished. Late 40s, confident. The kind of man who had spent years arguing on both sides of justice, depending on the paycheck. Proceed, Celeste said, her tone neutral. Given recent events, he gestured vaguely, as if the word assault was too messy to utter. We believe the court may no longer appear impartial. That the judge's personal involvement compromises the integrity of these proceedings. Celeste leaned back in her chair. The weight of his words hovered, waiting to be absorbed. You believe I am incapable of judging fairly because I was attacked. He hesitated. We believe perception matters, that it could affect the legitimacy of the ruling. She stood, walked slowly to the front of the bench. Let me be clear, she said, voice low and unwavering. I was assaulted, in this building, on the clock, in uniform, not because of anything I did, but because of who I am, because someone looked at me and decided I didn't belong. She paused, let the silence do the work. And in response, I didn't retaliate. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I took my seat. I listened to testimony. I followed every rule of judicial conduct, every protocol, every line of procedure. Her gaze pinned the attorney in place. You want to talk about bias? Let's talk about the bias that let a deputy keep his job after 12 formal complaints. The bias that let officers reframe violence as crowd control. The bias that hides in memos and signatures and the silence of powerful men who knew better and chose comfort over justice. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Celeste turned back to the courtroom. This is not about revenge. It never was. It's about accountability. She tapped the folder on her desk. Effective immediately, this court is enacting the Monroe Mandate. The room stirred. This mandate requires comprehensive anti-bias training, psychological screening, and regular evaluations for all courthouse personnel under this jurisdiction. It enforces a zero-tolerance policy for racial profiling, harassment, and the misuse of authority. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratched furiously. And it does not end here, she continued. I will be presenting this mandate to the circuit, to the Judiciary Committee, to the Senate if I have to, because this cannot happen again, not to anyone. She reached for the sentencing file. Mr. Hank Riker, please rise. Riker stood between 2 officers, no longer in uniform, wrists bound, shoulders sagging under the weight of consequence. Celeste didn't look away. For abuse of power under federal law, this court sentences you to 6 years imprisonment. For civil rights violations, 5 additional years. And for obstruction of judicial function, 1 year. She paused, but that's the legal part. Riker blinked, slowly. Now for the human part. You believed the badge made you untouchable. That procedure was a shield for cruelty, that no one would ever hold you to account because the system was on your side. She stepped closer, her voice dropped. But I am the system now, and we are not on your side. The officers led him away. No one clapped, no one cheered. They just watched, because it wasn't celebration, it was transformation. Celeste turned back to the court. This mandate is not a punishment, it is a warning. To every institution that chooses silence over justice, To every official who signs away dignity to preserve decorum, this ends now, and though the law cannot fix everything, it can start with one name, one ruling, one line in the sand. And today that line is mine. That night the house was quiet. No cameras, no murmurs behind courtroom doors, just the soft hum of the porch light flickering outside and the low buzz of clippers warming in her sister's hands. Celeste sat still in the kitchen chair, hands resting in her lap. The last tufts of uneven hair clung to her scalp like ghosts of something once carefully kept. Her robe hung on the hallway hook, folded, unworn. Her nameplate sat face down on the edge of the counter. She didn't need it tonight. "You ready?" Neen asked softly. Celeste nodded. "Yeah, let's finish it." The clippers moved slowly, gently, each pass precise. No rush, no fear. This wasn't like before. This wasn't about humiliation or control. It was about choice, about reclaiming what had been taken without permission. Hair fell in quiet spirals onto the kitchen floor, silver against tile. The sound was different this time, not cruel, cleansing. When Neen was done, she unplugged the clippers and handed Celeste a mirror. Celeste didn't look right away. She held the mirror in her lap for a long moment, then finally lifted it. Her reflection stared back, bold, bare, strong. She touched her scalp, traced the line above her ear where the blade had bitten too deep. The skin was still tender. But it didn't sting. "You could rock that every damn day and still own every room you walk into," Neen said with a grin. Celeste didn't answer at first. Then she whispered, "This is who I am now." Neen stepped behind her, placed both hands on her shoulders. "No," she said, "this is who you've always been. Now the world just caught up." The next morning, Charleston woke to gray skies and soft mist hanging low over the city. Celeste stepped out of her house in a navy trench coat and slacks. No scarf, no hat, her head bare to the chill in the air. She didn't flinch, didn't hide. She walked with the same quiet purpose that had carried her into that courthouse days ago, but lighter now. As if every step was no longer carrying the weight of silence. Outside the courthouse steps, a few people had gathered. No media vans, just citizens, neighbors, onlookers who had seen the footage, read the reports, heard the verdict. Among them stood a teenage girl in a black hoodie, brown-skinned, slight frame, eyes wide behind thick glasses. She looked nervous. When she saw Celeste approaching, she hesitated, then stepped forward. Celeste slowed. The girl pulled down her hood. Her head was shaved, clean, unadorned. "I wanted to look like you," she said quietly. Celeste looked at her, really looked. The girl's lip trembled, but she stood tall. "You don't have to," Celeste said. "I know, but now I want to." Celeste nodded once, and in that moment something passed between them. Not applause, not speeches, just recognition, a silent inheritance, strength unspoken. Later that morning, the courtroom filled again. Routine case, civil dispute. Nothing headline-worthy, but the energy was different now. Celeste entered through the main doors, not the private chamber. Her robe was folded over one arm. She carried it, not because it gave her power, but because it no longer defined it. Before the clerk could say a word, the room rose. Every person, every row, not because they were told to, but because they chose to. Celeste stood still for a moment, letting it settle. Then stepped up to the bench and placed the robe across the chair. She didn't wear it right away. She didn't need to. The law continued. Cases were heard, arguments made, but something had shifted, not in the words, in the room. Respect was no longer conditional, power no longer assumed, and justice no longer silent. That afternoon, as she passed through the courthouse corridor, a janitor gave her a subtle nod and tapped a closed fist to his chest. A young security officer flashed a quiet thumbs up, then quickly looked away, cheeks flushed. Celeste kept walking, not faster, not louder, just fuller. As if for the first time in years, she remembered what it felt like to take up space without apology. In the break room, someone had taped a newspaper clipping to the fridge. Federal judge refuses to step down after assault, launches reform from the bench. Underneath it, written in black marker, "She's our judge." Celeste smiled. She hadn't asked to be a symbol. She just refused to disappear. And somewhere across town, a girl walked into school with her head held high, no hoodie, no shame, only pride. Because today, justice didn't wear a robe. It walked in bare. and stood tall anyway. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.